Greetings, everyone. My name is Sonyol, President of the East Asia Institute. I'm honored and pleasured to invite distinguished panelists and moderators to this webinar titled What's Next for the U.S.-Japan-Korea Partnership, Security and Economic Cooperation in a New Era. This event is co-hosted with Stanford University's Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. My special thanks to Professor and Director of the APARC, Ki-Uk Shin, for his friendship, continuing support, and cooperation to EAI. Upon the announcement of the two joint statements from ROC US and US-Japan Summit meetings, respectively held in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, academics and opinion leaders have forecasted a possible expansion of security and economic cooperation among South Korea, Japan, and the United States. However, the geopolitical tension arising from the U.S.-China strategic competition and the severed bilateral ties between Japan and South Korea, among others, have complicated the strategic calculus of U.S., Japan, and South Korea. As U.S. shift primarily to peer-to-peer competition with China, questions arise. Will North Korea become less of a priority for the United States, or do its location in relations to China increase U.S. intent to open dialogue and encourage closer inter-Korean relations? Will South Korea, Japan, and the United States be able to recover and increase their trilateral security cooperation over several issues? And can Japan and South Korea improve their deeply severed bilateral relationship in the near future? How does the outlook for South Korean, United States, American, and Japanese firms look like amidst the restraint in the global supply chain? Can three countries actually foster an open, liberal, and inclusive economic architecture in the region? With these questions, and under these circumstances, South Korea, Japan, and the United States must define their economic and security interests and seek ways to maintain friendly relations among them. This seminar will discuss security cooperation touching upon the issues of denuclearization of North Korea and geopolitical tension from U.S.-China strategic competition. And panelists also discuss economic cooperation in the realm of the direction of the future technology and trade policies of three countries and economic security over the global supply chain. Thank you, everyone, and I hope today's webinar stimulates practical and insightful dialogue among the trade policymakers and academia. I will now pass on the mic to Professor Ki-Uk Shin.
Morning to our friends and viewers in Japan, Korea, and elsewhere in Asia. We have done some joint programs with EAI before, and it's really our pleasure and honor to do again today. Dr. Son has already mentioned and outlined key issues that we will be addressing today. And I think if there's any positive side of pandemic, is that we can do more actively do virtual programs like this across Pacific. As you know, in the United States, we have almost 1 year with a new Biden administration. In Japan, you have just a new prime minister and cabinet, and South Korea now in the middle of presidential campaign. So it's quite challenging time and a lot of uncertainties. At the same time, there might be some opportunities in the coming months and coming years. So today we have an excellent lineup of speakers from both academic and practical worlds. And actually, within our center, this is a joint program between Korea program and Japan program. So, as a whole, this shows a great collaboration among Japan, Korea, and United States. Hopefully, we can do similar collaboration in the policy arena as well. So once again, thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, let me turn to Dr. Ha-Young-sun, who will be moderating the first panel. As you know, Dr. Ha was a professor at Seoul National University, now chairman of EAI. Dr. Ha is a leading expert on foreign policy and national security in Korea. So it's a really pleasure to have Dr. Ha and all the panelists for today's discussion. So Dr. Ha.
Thank you, Professor Shin. It is my pleasure to moderate the first session of EAI and APARC webinar on the future of U.S.-Japan ROK partnership in a new era. We are now facing 4 different levels of new era. Primarily, the United States and China are now beginning to enter the period of strategic competition on the stage of economy, technology, norm, and military. Secondly, there are continuing risks of regional confrontations in the Indo-Pacific, such as North Korean nuclear issues, Taiwan, and South China Sea. Third, we are experiencing new political leadership in the region. And finally, we have to successfully get over with the COVID-19. Facing this kind of new era, we do need a new type of security and economic cooperation among 3 partner countries. For our effective discussion, program organizers prepared 5 basic questions for this session. First, how does and will South Korea define its own strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific? Second, under the strategic competition of the United States and China, what kind of trilateral relations do we expect among the United States, China, and North Korea? Third, can ROK and Japan, under the new leadership, improve the deeply severed bilateral relations? Fourth, how can we coordinate different positions on the sequence of 2-track strategy of complete denuclearization and complete security guarantee among North Korea and other relevant countries? Fifth, how can we develop the strength of the U.S. security guarantee towards South Korea and Japan against the rising threat of North Korea's rapidly growing nuclear capabilities? The first session of this webinar invites 3 prominent panelists from 3 countries. Let me introduce first Ambassador Park Joonwoo, former chairman of the Sejong Institute and former senior secretary to the President for Political Affairs. He was a career diplomat who served 33 years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including the ambassador to the European Union and Singapore. And next, General Vincent Brooks, former United Forces in Korea commander, recently retired from active duty at the 4-star general in command of all U.S. forces in Korea, UN Command, and the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. And Tomiko Ichikawa, Director General, former Director General at the, currently Director General at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. She joined the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1985. Her assignments included directorship at West Europe Division and Nuclear Proliferation Science and Nuclear Energy Division. She participated in the six-party talks and continued to follow DPRK nuclear issues at Permanent Mission in Vienna and the IAEA for 10 years. Let me turn over my mic to Ambassador Park. He will have a speech for roughly 10 minutes on the issues we will discuss. Ambassador Park.
Thank you, Professor Ha, for your kind and generous introduction. I would also like to thank Professor Shin and Professor Son for giving me this valuable opportunity to join today's online seminar. It is so nice to meet virtually other panelists, Director General Ichikawa and General Brooks, and especially my old colleague Tom Finger at APAC. As Professor Ha just explained today's subject, trilateral cooperation among the US, Japan, and Korea has been the key mechanism in dealing with North Korean provocation since North Korea started nuclear development in the early 1990s. Since the Biden administration was inaugurated, the United States is strengthening this trilateral cooperation in its efforts to counter China's growing assertiveness. As Korea's dependence on China deepens in trade and supply of raw materials essential to industry, and current Moon government's inclination to China continues, it is not easy for Korea and current Moon government's it is not easy to actively engage in the US-led anti-China alliance. Korea-Japan relationship, further worsened by protracted war over territorial and historical disputes, also hinders Korea's active engagement in the trilateral cooperation. There is a saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. As Korea-Japan relations deteriorated and remains at the worst level, it has become the weakest link in the US-led trilateral cooperation. As I have only 10 minutes, I will have to focus mainly on this issue. When the Biden administration was inaugurated last January, expectations were high in Korea for another restoration of Korea-Japan partnership under US leadership. Many Koreans remember that when Park Geun-hye government had difficulty in settling the issue of wartime comfort women with Japan, then Vice President Biden played an important role in the process of rapprochement between the two leaders of Korea and Japan. He visited the two main US allies in East Asia and mediated between the two leaders. After a year-long negotiations, Korea and Japan reached the Comfort Women Agreement in December 2015. Since then, Korea-Japan cooperation expanded to other areas, including security issue. In November 2016, Korea and Japan signed an important military information agreement. It was an overdue because of Korea's reluctance to engage in security cooperation with Japan. Restored cooperation between Korea and Japan was disrupted with the inauguration of Moon Jae-in government in May 2017. Moon government dissolved the Foundation for Reconciliation and Healing, which was established with the seed money provided by the Japanese government under the Comfort Women Agreement. Japan angrily reacted to this Korean government's decision. The two countries' relations further cooled down when a Korean Navy ship targeted its fire control radar to a Japanese maritime patrol aircraft in December 2018. In the meantime, a series of Korean court rulings on comfort women and forced laborers during Japanese colonial rule have worsened the bilateral relations, and Japan retaliated with export control of chemicals vital to Korean semiconductor manufacturing. Worsened relationship between Korea and Japan affects the trilateral cooperation led by the United States. Biden administration's policy to counter Chinese challenge extends globally in all directions and covers the whole areas of East Asia and Indo-Pacific. The United States revived the Quad cooperation with Japan, Australia, and India. They agreed on the importance of the Indo-Pacific region being free and open and bound by rules-based order. They called for freedom of navigation in the region, apparently challenging China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. In September, the US launched a new trilateral security partnership with the UK and Australia, named AUKUS. The United States promised to provide Australia with technology to build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. On the sidelines of G20 summit in Rome at the end of October, President Biden hosted a meeting on global supply chain resilience attended by 14 US allies. The Biden administration has been rallying allies to reshape the global supply chain and be less dependent on China. Coming December 9th and 10th, President Biden will host a summit for democracy, a virtual summit for leaders from more than 100 democratic countries in an apparent rallying against authoritarian China. All these initiatives by the United States since Biden took presidency are aimed at countering challenging ambitions of China and curbing China's growing global influence. In cooperation with the United States, Japan also heightened its military readiness by strengthening joint military exercises with the United States and other US allies in Oceania and Europe. Australia, New Zealand, UK, France, and Germany dispatched Navy ships and patrol aircrafts to join surveillance activity, tracking North Korea's violation of the UN sanctions. It is said that these unusual military activities are targeted at illegal transshipping of North Korean ships, but they are actually targeted at tracking and containing China's intensifying military activities in East and South China Seas. Japan's new Prime Minister Kishida confirmed he will closely work with the United States for the peace and stability for the region and realize a free and open Indo-Pacific. Since Xi Jinping took the leadership of China in November 2012, China has been intensifying its assertiveness. Starting Belt and Road Initiative, China has promised to spend about $1 trillion on building infrastructure in mainly developing countries around the world. During the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's founding on July the 1st this year, he warned that any infringements on China's sovereignty would be met by a great wall of steel. He declared that China would not tolerate preaching from others, and unification with Taiwan remained an unshakable commitment of the Chinese Communist Party. Tensions across the Taiwan Strait are ever high due to China's demonstration of its military power in the air and at sea. Chinese fleet even held joint exercise with Russian fleet, crossing international straits Tsugaru and Osumi in Japanese territory, which raised concern about Chinese threat among Japanese people. With all these developments surrounding the Korean Peninsula, it looks clear that the US and Japan is determined to strengthen and expand the cooperation among the three countries, including Korea. Daniel Creighton-Brink, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, who recently visited Japan and Korea, was reported to have discussed with his counterparts about how their alliance can contribute to promote the rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. He also said that the future three countries will be safer and more prosperous when Korea and Japan cooperate for the future, focusing on the common interest. Entering the final year of his presidency, President Moon made gestures for dialogue with Japan. During the New Year press conference in January this year, President Moon said he acknowledged the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement as an official agreement between the two governments. He offered a dialogue through his address commemorating the March 1st independent movement. Japan's response was cool, and persistent in demanding Korea's action to fully implement the agreement. Japan seems to be indifferent to whatever offers and gestures from President Moon and waiting for the time when Moon's term expires and new Korean government is inaugurated. Japan's new cabinet led by Prime Minister Kishida is said to be more open to keeping friendly relations with Korea. Foreign Minister Hayashi expressed his willingness to step up dialogue with Korea to improve their strained ties. Considering the upcoming Korean presidential election in March, chances for any breakthrough during the remaining Moon's tenure are slim. President Moon seems to be more inclined to meet his counterpart in the North and jointly declared the end of the Korean War. In addition, as presidential election campaign gets close and harsher, it is almost impossible for President Moon to make concession and improve relationship with Japan. Considering all these aspects, it looks more realistic to work for the improvement of Korea-Japan relationship when a new government is inaugurated in Korea next May. Whoever is elected, the new president will face the most difficult tasks to mend the ties with Japan and join the strengthened trilateral cooperation while balancing Korea's national interests between the US and China. The new governor's foreign policy needs to be pragmatic, considering the Moon government's leaning towards North Korea and China attitude disappointed many Koreans. Japan will also need to be flexible and keep the door open for a compromise with the new Korean government. The Biden administration, if it regards Korea as indispensable for protecting the vital interests of the US in its rivalry with China, must play a bigger role in a quiet and constructive manner. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ambassador Park. Ambassador Park gave his speech with special emphasis on the ROK-Japan relations. Our next speaker will be General Vincent Brooks. General Brooks, would you start your speech?
Certainly. And I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right, very good. Well, I first want to thank the organizers from the East Asia Institute and from the Asia Pacific Research Center for arranging this conference and especially for including me in it. I'm very honored to join this distinguished panel. I'll just begin by saying that it is my belief that the alliance system forged by the United States, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, is really being put to the test. And this is a period of testing that we must take note of and respond to. I mean, it brings questions like, what is the current value of the alliances to the parties involved? What will the alliance system be in the Indo-Pacific region? Will it gain strength under the pressures of really changing realities that are emerging from Chinese actions to reset the regional order, and also by the competing perspectives of self-interest? I would submit that the alliance system, featuring particularly, as we're talking about tonight, the US-Korea alliance, the US-Japan alliance, and the US-Australia alliance is as important now, if perhaps even more important, than it has ever been before. The alliance system capitalizes upon common interest and like-minded affinities. In this case, the democratic nations of the Indo-Pacific have common interest in economic cooperation, as we'll certainly discuss, and in mutual defense. And these two pillars, just as our discussion tonight is framed, these two pillars have really upheld the extraordinary prosperity and the flourishing societies of the allied countries. The democratic order, in my view, has been repetitively tested through the last 70 years. This is not the first test we're facing. And it has repetitively shown resilience and value. So in the present time, there's another period of testing. As we will certainly discuss many times today, the rise of China offering what is fundamentally a different political system centered on the Chinese Communist Party, guiding a state-controlled capitalist and expansionist economy is presenting a very fresh challenge to free market democracies. So maintaining a healthy alliance system really preserves alternatives to the Chinese model being exported around the world. The economic interests, in my view, are paramount. The security interests follow. I've spoken many times about the relationship among North Korea, South Korea, China, Russia, Japan, and the United States. And I've described it as being like a hand with North Korea at the palm and the other countries on each finger. So for example, if this is China and Russia and South Korea and the United States and Japan, alliance solidarity joins two fingers as one. And with increased cooperation, three as one. And I'm referring, of course, to South Korea, US, and Japan cooperation. The two alliances operating in harmony, not necessarily in alliance. I think that's a step that's beyond current reach, but operating with harmony is not beyond reach. North Korea would always seek to separate the fingers. And so would China, and so would Russia, who prefer to have each finger operating independently. And this is a design for weakness. Whereas solidarity and mutual support represent a design for strength. So the alliance system should not be viewed as a US construct representing a previous international order. Rather, it should be viewed as a modern construct that joins several of the world's most robust economies, liberal democracies, and militarily capable nations. And ladies and gentlemen, I think my key point is cooperation matters. The opportunities on the horizon for the new administrations in the United States, Japan, and ROK, and I will treat them all as new, since each of them will have 18 months or less in position by mid-2022. This will include an opportunity to build upon the existing alliance system and to strengthen it by ensuring the democracies of the Indo-Pacific operate in harmony. Now, each country has its own history. Each country has its own interests. But success will come in recognizing the commonalities and building upon them, while also certainly recognizing the unique perspectives that are brought on any issue. The reality is alliances are fed by the balancing of self-interest with collective interest. No single point of view should win all the time. And it's my hope that the Republic of Korea, the United States, and Japan, as the alliances of Northeast Asia, will look for strengthening opportunities and will recognize the value of harmonious relations. Leadership in each country will have the obligation to communicate the value of the alliances domestically and to also demonstrate the value of the alliances internationally. I'm of the view that cooperation enhances security. Some political risk will be required to improve trust within the triad of Korea, the United States, and Japan. Trust is not sufficient at the present time. You know, during my service in Korea, I witnessed firsthand the limitations of operating without direct communications among the allies of the United States. And this was particularly manifested in the experiences that I had during the missile launches of 2016, especially as North Korea continued to test with greater and greater success an array of missiles with ranges and capabilities to threaten the United States, as well as the two Northeast Asian allies. I would add, for that matter, Australia as well, but especially among those three. And as North Korea conducted those tests, those demonstrations, those provocations, the tests would trigger sensing and warning systems in each of the three countries. And in fact, each had a different set of puzzle pieces, I'll refer to this metaphorically, looking at the same puzzle. The US, as the common ally, had direct communication and the fullest picture of the puzzle because it had its own picture and it had Korean and Japanese information. But the other two, Korea and Japan, without direct communication with one another, were each frustrated time after time that the United States, complying with the information security restrictions and requirements established by each ally, could not share the full awareness or would have to relay information that was permitted to be shared across the alliance boundary. It was slow. It created unneeded frustration while also impacting the quality of the responses. As was already mentioned, the General Security of Military Information Agreement in 2016 created a conduit to overcome these limitations. The US was not the relay, and the trust began to rise between the Korean and Japanese governments, even in the conditions of great pressure. Some political risk had to be taken to create the Jusomia, and political risk had to be taken to preserve it when dissolution of the Jusomia appeared to be imminent. The sharing of military information is a minimal level of cooperation. Much more can be done and should be done. China and Russia have both challenged the quality and the resilience of the alliances, and they have routinely exploited the seams and the sensitive points. Two particularly come to mind: the overlapping air defense identification zones of Japan, China, and South Korea, for example. That's where Russia and China both fly to challenge not only the officiality of the zones, but also the responses to penetrations of the zones. Or an even more sensitive point, then that is the contested Dokdo, Takashima, or Leoncourt rocks, whichever you choose to name it, which further aggravates existing political sensitivities, and we see how sensitive that is even today, and it complicates military responses and can lead to some of the friction points that have already been highlighted. This is, in my view, an unacceptable status quo because it works to the disadvantage of the alliance system. I would submit to you that exercises, whether they're small and quiet tabletop discussions or alternatively full-scale military actions coordinated multinationally to rehearse and to normalize procedures for interaction, these exercises would make a substantial improvement in security and in deterring Chinese and Russian adventurism while also building some bridges of trust among the democracies of Northeast Asia. And this is just one example among numerous opportunities. Finally, let me just say that each country must see itself as threads in a tapestry of international relations and to seek complementary opportunities to enhance the regional as well as the international order based on the alliance system. Groupings like the Quad, we've heard that mentioned already, and even agreements like AUKUS, which we've also heard mentioned and is most newly created. These are reflections of an outward-looking awareness. The cooperation among the democracies of the Indo-Pacific is clearly in the interest of each. And the synergy, being of course greater than the sum of its parts, of any cooperative arrangement will be a critically important factor in shaping the international order for a new era, one that includes and also impacts a very capable, emergent China, which is pushing a contrarian order. The presence of trust precludes the exploitation of seams, while the absence of trust is an attractive target for exploitation. The building of trust can't occur in an instant, while the fracturing of trust can occur in a single incident. So it's time now for the democracies of the Indo-Pacific and the allies of the United States to build the trust needed to shape the emerging order for the remainder of the century. Those are my opening thoughts, and I look forward to the rest of the dialogue and conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Bruce? I will ask the Tomiko Ichikawa, would you start your speech?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the East Asia Institute and the Stanford University for organizing this event. And I'm very honored and happy to join this opportunity to discuss very interesting and important agenda. I will maybe make just 2 or 3 points here, maybe to offer a bit longer perspective of the North Korea's nuclear situation, and also the US-Japan ROK trilateral cooperation, mainly based on my own experience. First of all, the DPRK nuclear situation and the US policy. I think the question was asked whether the current US administration under President Biden is rather prioritizing China and not prioritizing the DPRK. I think it is clear that the Biden administration itself made it clear that its #1 priority is a strategic competition with China. And we heard that the Biden administration had completed its policy review on the DPRK and said that it is waiting for the DPRK to decide whether or not to engage in the negotiation. From the outside observers, it does not seem that the US is really putting the priority in terms of the timing in engaging with the DPRK. On the other hand, I do not believe that the addressing the issue of the nuclear and missile issue of the DPRK is of low priority for the US, because I think General Brooks is already telling us and can tell us more maybe how important it is to address the increasing threat of the DPRK's missile capabilities when imagining that it can be coupled with its nuclear capabilities. And the DPRK seems to be determined to continue its nuclear and missile development activities despite all the difficulties it faces. General Brooks just mentioned his experience with the DPRK's missile tests in 2016. This year, we are witnessing again many missile tests by the DPRK of probably various different kinds. It means DPRK has been so far not conducted the ICBM or longer range missile tests or nuclear tests. Probably the DPRK is also watching the Biden administration's approach and policies. We are not quite sure how the DPRK might react in the near future when it sees no prospect or little prospect of improving its relations with the with the US in the near future. So we will have to see how the policies, both on the US side and the DPRK side, might develop. My second point is on the US-Japan ROK trilateral cooperation. And on that, I'd like to offer a bit longer timeline than just focusing on right now. Because actually in the late 1990s, when the DPRK was going through the so-called arduous March hardship period, and almost immediately after the first US DPRK framework agreement was concluded, it was that time in the late 1990s that the US-Japan ROK really started in discussing specifically the DPRK agenda at the high government officials level as trilateral meeting. The first such meeting took place actually in Hawaii in January 1996. And actually, as a young diplomat, I was part of the Japanese delegation there. So since then, this type of trilateral meetings, sometimes at foreign minister levels, sometimes and quite more often at high government official levels, continue till today. As we saw, I think just 2 days ago, I understand that the public aspect of that event was affected by the bilateral relations. But on the other hand, the trilateral meeting itself took place at such a high level, at a very high government official level, and which is, I believe, important to continue. So I think there are two aspects on this. We can see the current Japan-ROK relations as difficult. I think no one can deny that. On the other hand, there are discussions and cooperation going on at such levels, which is also, I think, worth noting. So we have to probably continue with that kind of dialogue, particularly trilateral dialogues. And actually, I see so many meetings this year, probably in response to so many DPRK missile tests. But the discussions among these countries at that level is continuing. And I think this is very important to note. I'm not a security expert, but just to mention, just to respond to what I think both Mr. Park and General Brooks mentioned about Quad, AUKUS, and the security situation in the region. I think from the Japanese point of view, it is also important for Japan to really think through its policy and security framework and the future course of its policy under the new Kishida government. And we understand that the Prime Minister Kishida already announced his intention to review the Japan's current national security framework in a kind of overall as a whole package, not only the defense posture, but the national security policy itself, which I think is really timely and necessary under the current security situation in this region. And regarding Quad and AUKUS, Japan is really kind of strongly promoting the free and open Indo-Pacific. And within that framework, this Quad group is a very important cooperative framework for Japan. And as both speakers prior to me just mentioned, US announced this new cooperative framework of AUKUS with Australia and the UK. I think in addition to the quite well-established security alliances, many small kind of so-called unilateral or small groups for various purposes on a flexible and ad hoc way will certainly enhance the cooperation in this region. And Japan, I think, is really putting its emphasis in promoting free and open Indo-Pacific concept. And Quad is really kind of a very important central piece in it. But not only that, I think engaging many other countries in this region, including and particularly ASEAN countries, will be also important in trying to address the current security situation in this region. Maybe I will stop here as my initial remarks, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much for three panelists who gave us a very much interesting presentations on the issues we will further discuss. For our second round of discussions, I will give a very brief questions toward each panelist, and we will continue the second round discussions. And there are also a couple of questions from the audience. I will include such questions toward each panelist. First, Ambassador Park, based on your experience of the career diplomat and also senior secretary to the president, how would you recommend the first step toward the new government of next presidential election for the betterment Korea and Japan relations? And also, how would you forecast the chances of betterment of Korea-Japan relations during the next administration? That is the first point. Second point, if you have time or if you don't mind, would you give a little bit further comments on the next government's basic position on the dilemma of the strategic competition between U.S. and China? That is the first questions toward the Ambassador Park. And next couple of questions toward the General Brooks. Question 2. There is a question from the audience. There have been diverse views on the end of war declaration, the most recent being former U.S. forces in Korea Commander Abrams stating that it could be reopened the door to hostilities on the peninsula. What are your thoughts on the prospects of the declaration? And second question of mine is related about there are some kind of discussions in ROK, how should we respond to the continuing development of North Korean nuclear capability? From that aspect, would you explain a little bit about the efficiency of extended deterrence or strengthening the capability of extended deterrence toward such kind of the North Korean nuclear capabilities? And finally, toward the Tomiko Ichikawa, as I briefly mentioned in the basic questions, it seems that there are different types of two-track policies of North Korea, U.S., China, even in ROK. How can we manage those kind of different type of the two-track policies? One is the complete denuclearization, another one is complete security guarantee. How can we manage the sequence of those kind of two basic points? That is the first questions. And second one, Quad issues. We all know China is complaining about the possibility of the anti-China partnership in the context of Quad. How can we successfully manage that kind of the effectiveness of Quad, not only as the military partnership and also the non-military partnership? How can we accommodate those kind of dilemma that issues? So I will turn over my microphone to the Ambassador Park. Would you start the questions?
Okay. Well, it's not easy to predict how the next new Korean government will act. Now we have 110 about 10 days until the presidential election in early March next year. Both ruling and opposition candidates have not yet made clear their campaign pledges on foreign policy. But one thing is clear, as I have already mentioned in my statement, the Moon government's leaning towards North Korea and China attitude has been disappointed many Koreans, even allies. So the next government, whoever will be elected, should be pragmatic. Some diplomats who joined the camps in both ruling and opposition candidates, they already expressed their policy line that the new government will be pragmatic in their approach to diplomacy. So I hope that the new government, whoever is elected, will be pragmatic to mend the ties with Japan. 23 years ago, when Kim Dae-jung was inaugurated in 1998, at that time I was the director of Japanese affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I worked for the restoration of bilateral relations for almost a year. When the President Kim Dae-jung was inaugurated, Japan scrapped the fisheries pact with Korea. So the relations was at the very low. So it was an urgent task for the new government to restore the relationship. At that time, Kim Dae-jung and Japanese Prime Minister Obuchi trusted each other, and after almost a year of negotiations, we had a joint declaration by Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi. So I hope that the new government in Korea will learn a lesson from the Kim-Obuchi declaration and make progress with Japanese new Prime Minister Kishida. And regarding the security cooperation between Japan and Korea, it has been a taboo for Korean people to cooperate in security issues with Japan. It started only about 20 years ago. As General Brooks mentioned, it is very important for not only for United States but for Korea and Japan to share military information in coping with the North Korean provocations. I hope that when Korea and Japan overcome the difficulties and resolve the current disputes, they can join hand in countering regional risks and North Korean provocations. Thank you.
Next, General Vincent.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ha. The questions are very interesting ones. I'll try to be somewhat brief in my response. First, I'd say with regard to end of war declaration, I know it's certainly a hot topic that is becoming politically charged. And so I certainly want to be careful about that because it's not my intention to inflame the circumstances at all. I would first say, taking note of what General Abrams has commented on, there are absolutely significant risks to an end of war declaration. I also believe, however, that there are significant risks to maintaining the status quo. It is possible to maintain the armistice for an extendedly long period of time, as has already been the case since 1953. But the armistice was always intended to be a temporary condition until a lasting peace could be attained. It's my opinion that a lasting peace will not come from a perpetuation of armistice. that doesn't lead to peace unless there's something else that is a more unique step, perhaps even a disruptive step to go there. And not to get in the way of Director General Ichikawa's response that will come here in a moment, but the sequencing question that you posed to her is relevant here also. Again, I am taking this as my opinion, certainly not any official view, but I believe that there is what I've called a cultural conundrum. The view in the West on how the sequence of actions should occur in the relationship between trust, relationship, and denuclearization. Among those three, the Western view has certainly been, for many years, show denuclearization actions, real concrete actions, and then trust can be built, and then the relationship can change. But it's been my impression from North Korea that that's not what they seek. I believe that they will release their possession of nuclear weapons. Not everyone agrees with me on that. It is a long road before that will happen, but it will begin with a changed relationship. So it's the exact 180-degree opposite of the Western view. Change of relationship comes first, which then builds trust. And then there will be denuclearization actions when there is a depth of security guarantees that has been reached, which has not been reached before. So I believe this is fundamentally about North Korea's sense of economic security as well as physical security. And the superficial discussions will always begin with physical security. So the end of war declaration, I believe, has value and does also have great risk, some of which we've talked about. If it becomes politically charged and becomes equated to a reason to reduce U.S. force presence on the Korean Peninsula or to eliminate United Nations command abruptly, these are mistakes that would be made by any political leaders if they follow that path. Those are mistakes. They're not fundamentally linked to an end of war declaration, but if they're allowed to be linked, then it will be a mistake. So the danger of moving forward with an end of war declaration is one that is mostly driven by thoughtfulness in the approach. And it cannot be blown by the political winds in such a significant way that it is done for populist reasons rather than pragmatic reasons. That's my opinion on that. Now to the extended deterrence question. Extended deterrence to me is first about capability, but more importantly about trust. Does the beneficiary of extended deterrence, in this case, Japan and South Korea, do those two countries believe that the U.S. will stand by its commitments and provide extended deterrence so that neither of the two countries requires a nuclear capability themselves? If that trust question erodes, and I believe it has eroded and may continue to erode, then national self-interest begins to rise and a desire to have some equilibrium in the capabilities possessed by each nation relative to North Korea begins to rise again. So we're having these kinds of discussions. I had the opportunity, I'll end on this point, to try to convey the realities of extended deterrence, which are difficult to do because of the nature of the systems that are used to provide that extended deterrence. But we took some members of the South Korean National Assembly and the chairman of the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff to board a nuclear submarine with ballistic missiles aboard, and to show them the reality of what it is that the U.S. provides. It's always in the neighborhood. And so just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And trying to get to the level of trust that makes it possible to recognize that it is there and that the relationships among the countries will determine the nature of the use, but the capability is absolutely there and should never be doubted. Well, that's easier said than done and requires strong diplomatic work and confidence building on multiple levels in order to try to get extended deterrence back where it belongs. An open dialogue about extended deterrence, I think, is very needed among the three new administrations.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ichikawa, would you respond to the questions?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador Park for reminding me of the time that we worked together on the bilateral relations. And actually, regarding the first question asked about the security guarantee, actually, General Brooks already made quite very important and interesting remarks from the security military perspective. So I'd like to maybe add just 1 or 2 points from diplomatic and non-proliferation perspective. I think from actually my point of view and from the Japanese government point of view, I think too, whatever the mode or the time frame of the negotiation or agreement in the future, I think what is very important is not to lose the sight of the kind of goal to achieve in terms of denuclearization. Because quite often in the past, although North Korea at that time, maybe not now, committed to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, when we get into the concrete negotiations on the steps to taken, there were so many small steps which were reversible that the DPRK committed and took. But in the end, well, we see all of us where we are now because we are much worse off in terms of the North Korean nuclear capability and threat to the region and the countries in the region, as well as the countries beyond the region. If we compare the situation, current situation with where we were when, for example, the US North Korea framework agreement was abandoned, and also when the six-party talks ended. Well, we didn't think at that time, as I was participating in the now last meeting of the six-party talks in December 2008, we never believed it would be the end of the six-party talks. We all believed it was a short interruption. But since then, six-party talks was never revived. But now US tried another way of doing it, particularly under the Trump administration. He engaged the top, he did the top level diplomacy with Mr. Kim Jong-un. But then again, we ended up with really little to no progress on the nuclear front. And North Korea still continues to develop its nuclear and missile capabilities. So whatever the mode of the negotiations, I think that kind of end point needs to be clear. At the time of the six-party talks, there was actually a working group on the Northeast Asia security matters involving China and Russia. It may have been a way to address North Korea's concern on the security aspect from a wider perspective. But under the current US-China, US-Russia bilateral relations, maybe it's a bit difficult to think about such kind of multilateral framework. I don't have much time, so I'll just touch upon Quad. Actually, Quad is an interesting group, particularly involving India. And it is not at all an alliance, and it is not so much limited to military security, because in the Quad meetings in this year, they have been talking about provision of vaccines or the provision of quality infrastructure assistance. So it's much wider than security. It's not an alliance, and it's definitely not Asia NATO. But it's a very interesting group of very important major democratic countries in the region, which is, I think, a very particular feature of Quad. And this kind of very flexible and kind of ad hoc kind of type of grouping of friends, rather than very strict military alliances, may become even more important in this region in the coming years and decades ahead. That is my impression. Thank you.
Time is up for the first session, but there is an urgent question from Thomas Finger. Why does there seems to be no agreement on what should be considered the most important challenge in Northeast Asia? I will ask each panelist just respond to that question for 10 seconds response to that question. Ambassador Park, would you have a brief comments?
Well, I think the colonial rule by Japan and also the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949, and the Communist China, which conquered the whole continent, has no diplomatic relations with United States, and also no relations with South Korea and Japan until early 1970s. So we didn't have enough time to have context and discuss about the common interests. And at this moment, I think the most urgent and important challenge should be the U.S.-China rivalry and North Korean provocations. I think the countries in Northeast Asia can agree on that. Thank you.
Next, General Vincent Brooks.
It's a very interesting question. Of course, I think the answer has many parts, but one of them is where you stand depends on where you sit. And to establish something as the most important challenge will be somewhat dependent on what it is that is actually faced. Each country faces a different combination of challenges. I think perhaps one of the challenges that must be acknowledged as we're discussing tonight is that the challenge of gaining a cooperative spirit among the three countries in Northeast Asia, including the United States. And if that can be addressed, then perhaps the other ones can be addressed as well. And I don't know that it's necessary to say the most important, but to acknowledge the common problems that need to be addressed by that cooperation. So whether it's China on a much larger geopolitical scale, or whether it's North Korea as a very specific extant threat, that can be debated on which is most important to each one of the countries, but the acknowledgement that both of them must be addressed with a collective approach, I think, is the more important outcome.
Okay, next, Ms. Tomiko Ichikawa.
Yes, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I cannot answer in a kind of better way than my two previous speakers. Maybe just to say that it really depends again on where you are and what kind of time frame you have. I had really difficulty in explaining to, for example, our European friends that the Cold War hasn't ended in this region, in the East Asia or Northeast Asia, because everyone talks about the end of the Cold War. But the Cold War framework still remains in this region. And in addition to that long-standing framework, now, as everyone is talking about, this US-China competition is really kind of playing most obviously and visibly and fiercely in this Indo-Pacific region. So the combination of the both would be maybe the most important kind of overall situation. But again, what is important is depending on where you are, I think. Thank you.
Time is up for the first session. Thanks for the very much thoughtful speech and also very much interesting questions from the audience. I think there will be further discussions on the second session. Thank you very much, all the panelists and also the participants. Thank you very much.
I will begin the second section by saying I too am very happy to be included in this discussion. I thank the organizers on both sides of the Pacific, and I welcome any who have joined in this conversation specifically for the economic portion. The goal of this session is to assess the implications for Japanese and Korean firms and for the U.S.-Japan ROK partnership, of U.S. policies toward China, and policies limiting the sales and transfer of certain technologies. Our speakers will refine this core question as they think appropriate. In doing so, we hope to illuminate different dimensions of economic cooperation and the calculations of our three countries and their business communities. We have three excellent panelists to lead the discussion. To maintain continuity as we move from one speaker to another, I will introduce all of them now. And to maximize time for discussion, I will provide only very brief and therefore inadequate introductions. But I refer you to the biographic materials that have been provided. Each of our speakers will talk for 10 minutes. We will go in this order. The first is Young-Ja Bai, Professor of Political Science at Konkuk University. She obtained her BA and MA degrees in diplomacy from Seoul National University and earned her PhD in political science at the University of North Carolina. Her research interests include international political economy and technology and international politics. Recent publications include Network and National Security and North Korea and the World. Our second speaker is Andrew Grotto. Andy is a William J. Perry Fellow at the Cyber Policy Center and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, both at Stanford University. He received his BA from the University of Kentucky, MPA from Harvard, and JD from UC Berkeley. Before coming to Stanford, he was Senior Director for Cyber Policy in both the Obama and the Trump administrations. Our final speaker is Kimura Fukunari, Professor of Economics at Keio University. He received his Bachelor of Laws from the University of Tokyo and his MA and PhD degrees in economics from the University of Wisconsin. His research interests include international production networks and economic integration in East Asia. And I will ask each of our speakers to limit the remarks to 10 minutes so that we can have time for discussions. And we'll begin with Ms. Bai.
Hello. I'm Young-Ja Bai. I'm honored to join this webinar and talk and hear from you. Today, I will talk briefly on technology cooperation among US, Korea, Japan in the age of US-China technology rivalry, especially focusing on semiconductor sector. US, China, Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries have formed a highly interdependent relationship within the global value chain over the past decade. The industrial development of Korea has been carried out in the close cooperation with the United States and China within this global value chain. The recent US-China technology rivalry and US government's export controls and investment restrictions against China have posed a great challenge to the Korean government and firms. The Korean government does not provide clear guidelines on the firm's strategy in this situation so far. So the companies have adjusted their business strategies, watching the US regulations and the China's response. In the case of semiconductor sector, Korean firms, on the one hand, have decided to make large-scale investment in the US in response to the US government request, and on the other hand, continued to cooperate with China to the extent that US regulations are not violated. The reorganization of global supply chains in the high-tech sector would become evident And it could develop into a dual structure, I think. A certain degree of US-China decoupling would take place in some sensitive high-tech areas, and the highly interdependent supply chains across the countries continue to exist. From this point of view, there might be some space for the Korean semiconductor firms to strengthen technological cooperation between US and Korea, and at the same time maintain business relationship with China. Surely, as the tension between US and China would go high, the space might gradually shrink. Samsung has planned to build a state-of-the-art chip processing facility in Texas, Austin, maybe, in the United States. The final negotiations are currently in progress. Korean firms' investment in the United States would be helpful to complement US manufacturing capabilities and contribute to stabilize the US supply chains. Korean companies could also have opportunities for the stable growth and continuous technological innovation. However, we all know that this decision has made out of political and diplomatic consideration rather than the market logic. In fact, the reason that advanced semiconductor manufacturing facilities have not been operated in the US until now is mainly due to the market factors. Some estimate that Korean firms should have to bear extra 30% cost if they operate semiconductor fabs in the US. So I think the continuous support from the US government for the Korean investment is kind of very necessary. If the ongoing technological cooperation between Korea and US could develop into a solid foundation for the Korea and US alliance, it would at least 2 or 3 more years of preparation and need continuous support for a long time, maybe after Biden administration, for Korean firms to successfully construct and operate advanced semiconductor manufacturing facility in the US. In 2019, when the Japanese government restricted the export of semiconductor materials to Korea due to diplomatic conflict between two countries, it caused a great disruption in the supply chain of Korean semiconductor industry. Since then, Korean firms have been trying to localize semiconductor materials in order to decrease the risk. But this localization strategy has a clear limitation. The Semiconductor Industry Association of United States report insists that if all semiconductor manufacturing is done in the United States instead of importing manufactured chip, the production cost is expected to increase by 35 to 60%. The report argues that it is neither desirable nor possible for the United States and other states to pursue self-sufficiency in the global semiconductor value chain. Many countries now have been trying to secure supply chain by strengthening cooperation with the other countries. The US government has requested TSMC, Taiwanese firm, and Samsung to construct a semiconductor manufacturing facility in the US while supporting aggressive investment by US domestic firms like Intel and Micron. The Japanese government also have prepared a new semiconductor industry policy and supported TSMC's construction of manufacturing facility in Japan. And it was reported that Micron, US company, is also planning to build semiconductor manufacturing facilities in Japan. While dynamic across the US, Japanese, and Taiwanese semiconductor firms stand out, there is no cases of Korean semiconductor firms' new cooperation trial with a Japanese and Taiwanese company, and Korea seems to be somewhat lagging behind in a newly emerging coalition in semiconductor sector. Korean and Japanese firms have been competitors in the semiconductor sector, but they have also maintained a long-term cooperative relationships. As the diplomatic friction between two countries in 2019 extended to semiconductor sector, Korea and Japanese semiconductor firms' cooperation have weakened. It would be good to restore the channel of cooperation between two countries. You know, Korea has global stars like Samsung and SK Hynix, but the ecosystem to support them is pretty much weak. There is no Korean companies among world top 10 materials and equipment firms. On the other hand, Japan does not have any major big shot in semiconductor field, but there are many top-level materials and equipment firms. Although there exist some conditions for mutually complementary cooperation between two countries, it is true the prospects of cooperation between two countries are not bright. Economic security is one of the top policy agenda in new Kishida cabinet, and Ministry of Economic Security was newly established. The Japanese government is reported to plan to enact new economic security law, strengthening regulation on technology leakage to China. Japan's economic security strategy do not mention any cooperation with Korea so far. The Korean government is also responding to supply chain stability by organizing economic security task force, so on and so forth. But there is no strategy on how to build a Korean, technology alliance network, including Japan and Taiwan and other Asian firms, as well as US and EU. Economic security and securing supply chain would be one of the top priorities, no matter what government take office next year. Korea and Japan should try to find out a way to step up cooperation in the technology sector so that they could tide over the waves of US-China technology rivalry. Thank you.
We'll go right to Andrew Grotto. Andy?
Great. Well, thanks, Tom. Thank you to the organizers for including me in our discussion today. It's really good to be here. I've already learned a ton from the conversation so far. So I want to cover two topics. One is why decoupling is the wrong phrase to guide U.S. and allied strategy, and why reimagined or recalibrated interdependence ought to be our collective North Star as far as policy goes. And the second topic I want to talk about is why there's far more to the U.S.-China rift than the United States and China, and hint, it's not simply a great power competition. So, decoupling is this phrase that it's often heard in Washington D.C. as the goal of U.S. supply chain policy toward China. The phrase has fallen a little bit out of favor, but it's since the Biden administration took over, but you still hear shades of it in debate. And I want to pick on that phrase a little bit. I think its meaning is opaque at best, and it gestures towards an outcome that is both fantastical and not ultimately in U.S. and allied interests, even if it were possible to decouple. And I'll use semiconductors as a topic to illustrate some of these points as I move along here. It's fantastical because supply chains are simply too complex, intertwined, and global to ever be cleaved into decoupled American and Chinese supply chains. Counterproductive because America and its allies benefit from the ecosystem of comparative advantages and free trade that make the global economy hum and accrue benefits to allied economies. Now let's take the case of semiconductors. America's intensifying geopolitical competition with China and the global shortage of semiconductors have generated a lot of momentum in Washington to strengthen the resilience of the global semiconductor supply chain and to prevent China from dominating it. This has generated a lot of momentum. Key initiatives include a $52 billion legislative proposal to shore up the semiconductor industrial base, as well as actions to deny China access to semiconductor materials and technologies that could contribute to its military power. This is legislation, the U.S. CHIPS Act, that's made it through the U.S. Senate and is awaiting action in the House. I think there's a pretty good chance that it will get funded before the end of the year through the National Defense Authorization Act. Other countries, of course, are pursuing resilience strategies as well when it comes to semiconductors, although China looms less explicitly large in them. So in the case of semiconductors, decoupling is again, fantastical and counterproductive. So the intense capital requirements for many links in the supply chain for semiconductors favor suppliers that can achieve economies of scale, and this has resulted in consolidation of suppliers at certain key links in the supply chain. Fabs are a great example. This new fabs cost tens of billions of dollars to build. On top of that, the supply chain features extensive pre-commercial research, specialized design equipment, libraries of intellectual property, hundreds of specialty and commodity inputs, and dozens of classes of precision engineering equipment. Many of these inputs are themselves the products of still more specialty and commodity inputs. This complexity, and especially the myriad technologies involved in the supply chain, makes vertical integration really hard across multiple links, and favors firms that come to specialize in a particular link in the supply chain. And what's happened is, comparative advantage, including subsidies, and lower international trade costs, have organized these specialties on a largely geographic basis. So in the US, with our innovation ecosystem, we lead in the most R&D intensive area in semiconductors, chip design. Asia, where there's broad government support for capital intensive processing and manufacturing industries, leads in materials and manufacturing. And of course, within Asia, there's still further differentiation. For example, Taiwan is really, the only place in the world, or I think it has something like 92% of the capacity to produce semiconductors below kind of the benchmark 10 nanometer node. Korea, is exceptional in areas like advanced memory manufacturing. Japan, in areas like equipment and materials. For assembling and packaging, that third step in the process, it's less capital intensive, more sensitive to labor costs. So Asia leads as well there, with China and even countries like Malaysia making inroads. Well, the problem is this: the supply chain is brittle against natural disasters. This is not new. COVID and some of the problems that have afflicted the industry over the last 18, 24 months are not new problems. There have been other episodes in really recent history that have highlighted the brittleness of the supply chain against natural disasters. The supply chain may be purposefully manipulated by states. China is obviously top of mind for those of us in the United States. But I think, as some have mentioned, there's been this dispute between Japan and South Korea involving access to some key precursor chemicals that have been subject to export control from Japan to South Korea. There's also, and then of course, concerns driven by semiconductors being a key contributor to China's military rise. So to decouple this industry, easily $1 trillion upfront for the U.S. to achieve self-sufficiency, according to the Semiconductor Industry Association report that was mentioned a moment ago. 35 to 65% price increase in semiconductors. That's just the economic cost. There's a lot more. There are other costs as well that are important to talk about here. One is that decoupling would concentrate more risk in North America, which is problematic, especially when we think about how climate change is affecting North America and of course, the broader globe. Allies would suffer, I think, grave economic harm, respond with subsidies of their own. And then innovation would suffer too. Semiconductor, the supply chain, is not as resilient as we would like, but the impressive run that Moore's Law has had now for, almost 50 years, it really highlights how productively innovative the sector has been. It's hard to imagine this innovation not suffering significantly in a decoupling scenario. So what should the goal instead be? Well, from my perspective, I would argue that what we've got to do is recalibrate interdependence. And this can't be done without allied cooperation. I see at least 5 elements. One is to understand the dependencies and the relationships, business and geopolitical, behind them within the supply chain. The second is to develop market-driven and non-discriminatory options for enhanced resilience. The third element is to avoid overreach on export controls by focusing on technologies really that meet one of 4 characteristics. Either acting as a choke point. So, for example, rare earths is a choke point for many many modern digital technologies. Semiconductors are another one. Technologies that could erect competitive barriers. So for example, access things like advanced photolithography equipment. We're talking about semiconductors. Technologies that provide direct military application. That's sort of the most obvious one. And then last but not least, technologies that serve as accelerants for other technologies. So semiconductors, again, is a big one here because, semiconductors underpin, innovation and advancements in 5G, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, you name it. The fourth element for recalibrating interdependence, I think is to strive, we'll never get there, but to strive for zero asymmetric interdependencies, AKA dependencies with China. And then last, but certainly not least, and I hope we'll spend some more time talking about this in the Q&A, is the fifth element is managing disputes among allies. Overall, I think that the U.S. CHIPS Act does a pretty good job capturing much of this, but it's the allied part that I think still needs some refinement. I'm happy to dive a little deeper into that during the Q&A. Just to wrap up, I want to spend a moment talking about why I think there's a lot more to the U.S.-China rift than just the United States and China. Too often, this competition, this rift, is talked about as though it were simply, air quote, simply a matter of great power competition. U.S. versus China, with sort of the rest of the world, caught up in tidal forces caused by the two superpowers. I think, in fact, it's competition between two distinct systems, picking up on General Brooks's comments earlier, state-led capitalism with authoritarian characteristics versus liberal democracy embedded in a rules-based international order. It's funny, decoupling as a concept came into vogue in U.S. policy debate relatively recently, but it's been an explicit goal of China's industrial policy now for decades to achieve technological self-sufficiency and supplant the existing titans of cutting-edge technology in Japan, Korea, the U.S., and beyond. And so, I know there's a lot of talk about picking sides in the conflict and how some allies don't want to pick sides. I think this is way too simplistic. I think I would submit that we are all in this competition, whether we like it or not. It's not so much about picking sides. I think it's about thinking through how to recalibrate interdependence. Now, of course, the reality is that liberal democracies, precisely because we're liberal democracies and thus responsive to our electorates, will chart slightly different courses as we navigate this tension. But the challenge is going to be how to chart this course in a manner consistent with our economic interests, while at the same time holding core liberal democratic principles and the rules-based international order. It is fundamentally an optimization problem, and it's a problem to close out here that requires, to pick up General Brooks's phrase, of bringing the three fingers together in harmony. I look forward to your questions and yield the floor.
Thank you. Professor Clore?
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to talk about how the private sector in Japan is looking at economic security policies of the Japanese government, maybe. My starting point is economic reality in East Asia. So one aspect is that we are observing the weakening of the rule-based trading regime in East Asia. East Asia, actually including Northeast and Southeast Asia, that's my definition. This region has aggressively utilized the mechanics of international production networks or the second unbundling, and has achieved rapid economic growth and poverty alleviation. So both Japan and Korea have played active roles in Factory Asia, actually partially together with China, of course. The rule-based trading regime has been one of the necessary conditions for Factory Asia. So for the US-China confrontation and also the recent geopolitical tension started jeopardizing East Asia's stable and predictable business environment. That's one background. The other is the economic relationship with China. Despite geopolitical tension, decoupling has so far been partial, except industries products with sensitive technologies and rare earth, rare metal, as well as just a small part of medical essential goods. So with the earliest recovery of Chinese economy from COVID-19, trade and investment related to China has been very strong, actually, with Japan, Korea, and also even the US. So as I said, despite enhancing criticism on its political system, we are really worrying about that, and we are uncomfortable with the political system in China. But China is still a very important business partner for our private sector. So those are sort of background, and then looking at investment, trade investment related security issues, I think three a little bit different kinds of issues mixed up. Probably the government is intentionally doing that, but the nature is a bit different. So I'd like to talk about the three kinds of security, economic security issues. One is to avoid or reduce policy risks in the form of a discretionary trade policy by a superpower, say China. So an example is the rare earth, rare metal issue in 2012. So sudden changes in trade and related policies by a superpower or a threat of them are perceived as policy risks by the private sector. So we usually say that don't put all eggs in one basket. I think that's a very mild expression. The real issue is the policy risks. So superpower can manipulate policies time by time to make the counterpart uncomfortable. So that's one thing that we have to take care of. We have to take care of ourselves, definitely. So the private sector is certainly optimizing the balance between efficiency in division of labor and risk management. So how far the government can help the private sector is the issue. In the case of firms with possibly sensitive technologies or rare earth, rare metal, government is trying to quietly promote a reduction of the dependency on China. Doing that very quietly, but one of the really evident move was the METI subsidies for this purpose accelerate reshoring of factories related to sensitive technologies, rare earth, rare metal, and personal protective equipment. So I think the communication with the private sector by the government was not so bad in this front, And also, government is not forcing private sector to do this and do that, but the private sector will make a judgment. So I think it's a sort of healthy way to do. So we know that private sector knows sort of policy risks working with China, definitely, but still China is an important business partner. The second is the trade investment directly connected to hardcore national security. I think these are the realm in the international conventions like Wassenaar agreements and others. I think the scope is pretty well defined, relatively. So many Japanese still remember the bitter experience in Toshiba-Kronberg scandal in 1987. And also recently, we are observing the enhancing geopolitical tension in this region. So the government definitely should strengthen the system. So the interface with the private sector is not too bad in that sense. Actually, the security export control section of METI is taking care of that for the interface with the private sector. This is actually completely clearly separated from trade policy section in METI. They are not really communicating with each other quite often. But I think the communication with customs office and also Minister of Defense is not so bad from outsider's viewpoint. We have to make a little bit more amendment in other sectors like universities, taking care of some sort of sensitive technologies. We have to do a little bit more carefully to expand the scope to some extent, but it was not too bad that government is taking care of this aspect. So it was very unfortunate that the Japan-Korea issue was highly politicized. But from the viewpoint of the Japanese side, still we believe that some proper export control is a real issue to be solved before talking about the sort of political context. The third is technology competition. So the US and perhaps the whole Western world would need to be engaged in a technology competition against China. So this is deliberately mixed with others. Actually, it's mixed with national security, quote unquote. And in the context of national security, in the context of Japan, national security may have three kinds of meaning. One is, of course, direct, indirect technological links with hardcore national security. Second is the strategic thought on technology competition. Those are not equal, actually. The third is that we don't know the logic, but the Washington DC said that we should do this and this, and we have to follow. That's another context of national security. So I think the definition of national security is really multifaceted from the viewpoint of Japanese government. So private sector in Japan would like to know the scope of decoupling, definitely, because they are uncomfortable in working in supply chains. But the US does not seem to make it clear. So there are various stakeholders in the US probably, and then a clear consensus building may not be easy. Or we have some doubt that some of the stakeholders in the US may want to make the borderline deliberately blurred so that they could take advantage in the international competition. So knowing that the decoupling would be limited in scope at the end, allies or private sector must seek the optimum path of scope of cooperation. So for the third one, so private sector may feel that the Japanese government makes a little effort to make the scope of decoupling clearer and just policies the private sector without showing clear-cut criteria. Which would generate shrinkage effects of economic activities. This is not good. But how we could do that, that's probably difficult. As for the semiconductor case, Japan is likely to follow the strategic move of the US, but at the same time, we have some skeptical view on the effectiveness of strategic industrial policy. The Kishida government set up a Minister of Economic Security under the Cabinet Office, Cabinet Secretariat, but the scope and function of the office are not well defined yet. So the most important task for the government is to maintain the rule-based trading regime as far as possible, to make the economic dynamism in East Asia alive. There's no perfect answer, but probably at least we have to take care of the WTO reform and the effective utilization of mega FTAs like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all three of our speakers. We have a few questions in here that see if I could compress and combine it with a question of my own, which is, now it's the same question to all three panelists, that we've heard different dimensions of tension between governments and firms. And at least in the way this has been cast this evening, it's US government policies that put pressure on the governments of Japan and Korea, and either directly or indirectly pressure on firms in Japan and Korea, and of course, in the United States. So the question is, since firms are responsible for profit, that's why they exist, they have no responsibility for overall economic performance or for national security, however defined. That's a government responsibility. What is the proper balance between firms following the market, doing what is economically in their interest and in the interest of shareholders, and government ability to guide and therefore to limit the activities of firms? And where are we on that balance? Have US government statements, if not policies, moved too far in the direction of infringing on the private sector and firms, or not far enough? Because we are not getting, again, use General Brooks, the three fingers. We're not getting the cooperation, technological cooperation, security cooperation, political cooperation among the three allies in Northeast Asia. Are these technology measures making that situation worse, or can they be an instrument for enhancing cooperation across a wide range of activities? And let's just go in the order that people spoke initially. Ms. Pai?
I think it's not clear whether it is desirable for the government, to play an active role in the process of private sector's adjustment. I think it would be better for the firm to decide and the government to play a supportive role, as Professor Fukunari said in his presentation. If necessary, policies like subsidies or reshoring for the companies that are affected by shrinking relationship with Chinese firms could be helpful. So in Korea, currently a special law is being prepared to support high-tech sectors such as semiconductors, and I'm also watching with interest, what measures the new Kishida cabinet in its economic security law will contain. I think I hear today it is nice for me to find a lot of commonalities among our presenters to consider the cooperation among U.S. and Korea and Japan. I think Mr. Andrew Groth said that U.S.-China rivalry is a kind of competition between two distinct systems: state-led authoritarian capitalism versus rule-based liberal democracy. And Korea, and also Japan, need to find a way to navigate in a manner consistent with our economic interest, while at the same time upholding core liberal democratic principle. I totally agree with you, but in the case of Korea, this principle does not solve the problem. We still have to deal with the difficulties caused by U.S.-China conflict. Obviously, South Korean would not want to choose China's authoritarian political economy. However, Chinese market and economic relations with China is very critical to Korean economy. So I think South Korean people would first choose security and value first, and then strive maintain economic relations with China and minimize economic damage caused by U.S.-China rivalry. So I think allies must, as Professor Fukunari said, we must seek the optimal path of the scope of cooperation. So given this situation in China and Japan, I think the United States should not put too much pressure on its allies, on its relationship with China, and should give them kind of space and room to adjust themselves. Okay, thank you.
Can't get to my mic. Andy?
Hey, so I appreciated Professor Bai's comments, and the question you asked, Tom, was a hard one. Maybe I'll respond briefly to Professor Bai's comments and then come to your question. So, from my perspective, I don't think it's about picking sides, and I think that framing of the problem, I think, obscures the range and of policy options for responding to China's rise in the region. It's things that whether it's on the economic front, on the human rights front, on the military front, that we all, I think, object to. I think, I heard Jake Sullivan earlier this year. I often get asked by visitors to Stanford from abroad, what is the U.S. policy towards China? And I'm going to do my best to try to summarize what I have heard the administration say, which I agree with. All of which is consistent, I think, with both respecting the unique political economy that exists in all countries, but especially in liberal democracies, who have to be responsive to populist citizen sentiment. So I think shore up democracy at home and abroad, I think, is a key pillar. Repair relationships with and among allies, I think, is a key pillar. And then work with China where interests align, say climate change, and then push back on China where necessary, preferably with allies. Allies, I would argue, none of these are possible without allied engagement and support, right? So we talk about shoring up democracy at home and abroad. My earlier point about this being a competition between systems, I think, really hammers home how it's not just the resilience of a democracy, but the system globally that's really at stake here. when I think about repairing, relationships with allies, it's not just the damage wrought during the Trump administration. I think there's a lot of work to be done. We've talked about the South Korean, Japan relationship, to name one. So I don't see it as a picking sides activity. I see it as thinking through, looking ahead to the future where we accept that we have, I think, no choice but to accept that some degree of interdependence is inevitable. What can we do to maximize the prospect that interdependence doesn't corrode our economic strength and our democratic way of life? To Tom's question, it's funny. I've been in Silicon Valley now for 4 years. I spent most of my life in DC, most of my career in DC beforehand. Until a few years ago, when the very word industrial policy was like a bad word in Washington, right? You just never heard it, right? It was something that other countries did, and now it's in vogue. And I think the backlash, the shift really began to occur when, largely in response to China, and in particular, the Congress's changes to U.S. export control law and CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment laws in 2018, and the several-year process before then, kind of, I think, broke the ice, right? Where you had profit-oriented companies who were taking action that was not in the U.S. national security interest, so in some ways, I think that was kind of the gateway drug. I think we're still trying to figure out what is the appropriate balance between government intervention, what is the right form. So I don't have a good answer for you. Maybe perhaps Professor Fukunari does.
Professor Fukunari?
Thank you. I think, for example, government officials in METI and others, still we have some big fan of all industrial policy. So their idea would be that one context is, of course, decoupling. Another context is COVID-19, and they like to make supply chains transparent, and then try to pick up choke points, and the government should take care of that. So that's a sort of idea of a new industrial policy. But why supply chains are not completely transparent? We have to think of that. So big companies taking care of the whole supply chains, they like to see everything, of course. But the small medium enterprise do not want to disclose that kind of information. Who are their business partners and others, what was the prices? They don't want to disclose those kind of information. So there's a reason why supply chains are not completely transparent. So I think that even if a new a sort of revival of industrial policy is coming, private sector does not follow that. So I think that's a relationship right now between METI, Kasumigaseki, and the private sector in Japan. So from the viewpoint of private sector, definitely they like to know the borderline scope of decoupling. We know that the alliance relationship with the US is extremely important, even if the logic doesn't convince us that this is the right one, but we will follow that. But we like to know the borderline, what the scope of decoupling. Then the rest of the economic activities can be under the realm of economic logic. So I think that's probably the private sector in Japan is really hoping for.
Thank you very much to all of you for the responses. We have very quickly come to the end of the allotted time for this discussion. I thank all of those who participated on this panel. I wish there were more time to respond to more of the questions, but let me turn it over to Gyuk-shin.
Okay, thanks, Tom, for moderating. And we covered a lot of issues today, and then we have more to discuss. But it's very hard to stay for more than 2 hours on the Zoom. So we'll have to look for other opportunities. But I think this kind of intellectual and policy dialogue engagement are very, very important. And I learned a lot from today's discussions. And I really hope that we can meet in person, as pandemic is getting close to the end. At Stanford, we are pretty much back to normal, but still we have to do a lot of measures like wearing masks inside and weekly testing and so on. But it's great to see people from Korea, Japan, and United States. And thanks to our speakers, moderators, and audience for very stimulating presentation and discussions. And one thing before we end, I was asked by EAI that there is some survey question for the audience. So please fill out before you exit the Zoom. But thanks again for joining from Asia and United States. And it's getting late in the evening here, and I'm sure it's morning in Japan and Korea. So have a great evening and great rest of the day. So hopefully see you again. Then thanks again to EAI for really leading to organize this event. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you.